Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Global Imaging Ambassador. I'd like to run you through the camera settings I use when shooting landscapes. Now, I'll be using an A7R III for the purposes of this demonstration, but you will find these camera settings on other alpha cameras. Now, typically I'll be setting the camera up for use with a wide angle lens. Now, I'm either using a prime such as this 2.8 18mm Batis lens, or I'll be using one of Sony's FE 1635 zooms, either the f4 Zeiss or the 2.8 GM. Okay, so the sort of settings I'll be using are very reliable, and what I'll be doing is I'll be creating a preset for that, so you can dial them in simply one turn of the shooting mode dial. So let's get started. Now, many people when shooting landscapes will shoot in aperture priority, but I will typically be moving that dial around to manual because I like to be in complete control. Now we are going to deep dive into the menus, and we're starting at the very first menu there. Just keep an eye on the bottom of this window here. You can see as I navigate through the position that I am in the menus, and this will help you follow along on your own alpha camera. Now I'm using the file format RAW, and I'll also be using the uncompressed. Now this isn't available on the APS-C sensors, but on the full frame such as the A7R2, A7R3, A9, etc. you will find this uncompressed. This gives us the maximum amount of latitude for post-processing the files. Okay, so typically moving forward a tab, I will switch the long exposure noise reduction off. This is applied to RAW files as well as JPEGs. Now if you're shooting with 30-second exposures, that noise reduction in camera is going to lock you out of taking another shot for another 30 seconds. So I typically prefer to do the noise reduction in post-processing. If you would prefer the camera to do that noise reduction, then by all means switch that noise reduction on in camera. Now, Colorspace, it's typically really only makes a difference with JPEGs, so it doesn't really matter if you're working with sRGB or Adobe RGB. If you occasionally work with JPEGs, then I would advise for landscapes with rich colors to move that over to Adobe RGB. Now, lens compensation. Now, this is an important part of what we do, is we can optimize the image for any lens aberrations such as chromatic distortion or shading. Now this is possible to do this in post-production, and so if you switch these options to auto, you don't need to do them in a program such as Lightroom. So you don't want to be doing these lens corrections twice. For instance, especially with the lens shading, you're going to find that the corners are getting lighter rather than being corrected. Okay, so I typically use a remote release or an intervalometer when I'm shooting landscapes. Now, if you don't own one of these, I would actually, and also obviously a tripod. Now, sometimes the tripods I'm using, they can be very small. I have tripods that are small enough to fit in a messenger bag. Now, typically when I am shooting landscapes, I am very low to the ground. This is a way of getting more of the foreground into the image. So I do carry larger tripods when needs arise, but I'll often always be carrying one of these very small tripods. Now, if you are working with the drive mode set to single shooting, okay, that is fine for working with these remote releases, but if you don't own a remote release, then what I would advise is go into the drive mode and set that to self timer 2 seconds. This allows you to press the shutter release, take your hand away from the camera, let the camera vibration settle, and then the camera takes that shot. You can extend that to 5 seconds if required. Okay, now with these full frame sensors, I typically very rarely, if ever, bracket these days. But if you do need to bracket, especially working with APS-C sensors, then it is possible to set up the bracket self timer. This is another way of delaying 3 shots in continuous mode for those to be composited later in post-production software. Okay, now with the A7R III we do have a new feature. It's called Pixel Shift Multi-Shooting. Now this will require additional post-processing, so if you're not prepared to go that extra mile in post-processing, just make sure that is switched to off. Now if you are prepared to work with Pixel Shift Multi-Shooting, you are going to get extra dynamic range, less moire, and also extra detail in your shots. So although the post-processing can be time consuming, you do get benefit from doing this on the A7R III. Now I have created a tutorial, an editing tutorial, to show you my typical editing workflow when I do use Pixel Shift Multi-Shooting. Now, if we move forward to the third tab, you'll see that there is a memory. Now, it's too early to assign the settings that we've already set up to the memory because we need to set up some additional settings, but we will be coming back to this tab when we've set up all of the settings for landscape shooting. Now, the focus mode, I will typically work with manual focus. This is a very good reason for this. It's actually very easy for me to get the depth of field I need when using manual focus. It's actually faster than using autofocus. Now I'm just taking you over to a website which has a depth of field calculator. It's the Cambridge and Colour website, and it's showing that if I'm using an aperture of f/16, then on my 18mm Batis, then I'm going to get a depth of field from 1 meter to infinity by setting the focus distance to 5 meters. Now the camera and also the Batis lens will give you a readout when you hit that 5 meter focal distance, and so that is a very easy way of setting this focus. Occasionally, if the priority in the landscape is in the distance, I might move that out to 6 meters. But I'll certainly move that back to 5 meters, especially working with a 16mm, okay, or where the foreground is the hero in the element. Okay, if you want to maybe even shoot slightly wider to get the maximum sharpness from your lens, which can be achieved at apertures such as f11, then you may want to look at another movie I've created, which is quick and easy techniques to find the hyperfocal distance. This is actually quite easy on a mirrorless camera to do this. Okay, so let's go back to the menu settings here. Now, if you ever do need to drop into autofocus, the focus area I would be recommending is Expand Flexible Spot. Okay, now moving forward again onto the 9th tab, ISO, I'm going to set that to 100. There are some lower ISOs on the full frame cameras than 100 ISO. 100 ISO is the default or optimum ISO. Now with some camera systems, if you go lower than 100 ISO, you can compromise your dynamic range, the ability for the camera to record detail in shadows and highlights. But on the A7R II and A7R III, actually you don't lose any dynamic range by maybe choosing 50 ISO. Having said that, I will basically set this up for 100 ISO now. Okay, metering mode. This really doesn't make that much difference, to be honest. I'm going to be reviewing an image and adjusting the exposure as I go, but typically I'll have the metering mode set to multi. White balance, again, this is really only applicable to JPEGs. If you notice the white balance is well out when you're taking your shots, you can always move or correct that white balance to create a custom white balancing camera. But remember, you can do this in post-production, so you don't need to worry too much about the color that isn't precisely accurate in camera. Okay, dynamic range optimizer. Now this is a setting that is applied to JPEG only. It's not applied to the RAW, but we can alter the preview in camera, and it can make the seeing into the shadows so much easier when we're shooting high contrast landscapes. Typically, if I've got a very high contrast scene and the foreground is very dark, I'm going to switch that dynamic range optimizer to LV5. This is going to significantly brighten the dark shadows, and this may help me see into those shadows to work out a focus point that I'm trying to achieve. Another setting that is also only applied to JPEGs is the creative style. But this is another reason that I may want to go into this, is because again it alters the preview. It also alters the review of our images. Okay, and I'll look at the next slide or two to show you that. Now typically what I'll do is, in order to get an accurate histogram on the back of the camera, I'll often lower the contrast in the creative style, maybe dialing that back as much as -3, which is the maximum minus setting on that. Just to show you what this does when you're reviewing your image, just hit the review when you've taken an image, and then hit the display button on the top of that dial. Now you'll see the histograms, okay, the red, green, blue and luminosity histograms, and if you see areas of the file blinking, that is warning you of overexposure. But that overexposure tends to come in a little bit early because the camera thinks you're recording JPEGs. So the histograms are really optimized for the JPEGs, not the raw files. So by lowering the contrast setting in your creative style, you can lower the blink is basically what they're called. The blink is coming in warning you of overexposure, when in real fact that you're not really overexposing those highlights. And the optimum exposure for landscapes is the highest one that you can do before overexposing those highlights. Okay, so moving forward onto the 13th tab, we've got focus magnifier time. Now if you want to take your time achieving that focus, I would set that to no limit, so that gives you plenty of time then to move in and review those foreground objects that you're trying to achieve focus in. Okay, now one of the things that I'll often be working with, especially in seascapes, is I'll be working with an ND filter. Now I'll work with two ND filters on my Batis. I'll have an ND 200, which is 7 2/3 of a stop, and I'll also work with an ND 8, which is 3 stops. And on the Batis I can actually combine both filters without clipping the corners of the file, and I can get more than 10 stops of reduced light. What this does is it allows me to slow down the exposure. So typically if we're working in sunlight, even though we've lowered the ISO to 100 and closed the aperture down to f16, I might only be able to achieve a 50th of a second, and that's not enough to smooth or make waters tranquil. Okay, so as soon as I pop that ND filter on, I am able to push that exposure time out to 10 seconds or more, right up to 30 seconds. I typically don't go over 30 seconds unless it's very important to me, because we are going to lower the bit depth from 14 to 12 when we go into bulb mode. Okay, so I'm working with a 10-second exposure here, which is again smoothing those busy waters out. Now you will find that if you're trying to use your magnify focus with an ND filter on, you may have trouble seeing in those shadows even with a dynamic range optimizer on. So you may want to whip that ND filter off to get the focus and then put that back on. Okay, steady shot. Typically if you're working with an ultra wide angle lens with a short duration shutter speed, leaving the steady shot on doesn't really compromise the file that much. But with very long exposures and with telephoto lenses, steady shot will work against you when the camera is on a tripod. So if you are looking for optimum sharpness, I would switch that steady shot off. If I just go back to that steady shot, just notice that that is in the second camera panel there. So we've come away from that first one, and one of the only settings we're picking up from that camera panel, the second camera panel on the 4th tab, is that steady shot feature. As soon as we've set that, then we're ready to come back to that first camera panel and come down to number 3, back to our memory, and this allows us to register all of these settings. Okay, once we go enter into that, we will typically enter in 1, 2 or 3. I'm going to enter all of my settings in number 1 now, and as soon as I press the button in the center here, I'm going to register that. Okay, so once it's registered, As soon as I want to recall all of those settings, like I've been shooting something else completely different to landscapes, if I just want to recall all of those settings I've just set in, all I need to do is turn the shooting mode dial around to number 1. Okay, so a couple of other things that I might do just to make the shooting experience for landscapes just a lot easier, especially if you're working in dark environments and you really want these settings at your fingertips. And setting the down button, which doesn't have assigned to it any sort of function or custom operation, I'm going to set that up with my focus magnifier, so I don't have to go hunting through the menus looking to zoom in when I'm in manual focus. You can set that up to another custom button, but I'm just setting up to the down button just because that doesn't yet have anything assigned to it. Okay, so next I'm going to come over to the function menu. Now the function menu set allows me to apply some commonly used settings and put them into the function menu, so I don't have to remember which tabs they're in. A couple of the ones that I might assign to the function menu is that pixel shift multi-shooting, so that I don't have to remember which panel it is in the menus. Another one that I might assign is to go in and switch the steady shot off and on, because typically as soon as that camera comes off the tripod, I do want to remember to put the steady shot back on for any handheld low light work that I'm working with. So just remember, you can add more of your favorite settings to that FN menu or function menu, and that is highly advisable. Okay, and those are my two favorites for landscape shooting. Okay, hopefully you've enjoyed watching me go through my camera settings for landscape. You can catch up with me in a variety of social media environments. You can find me on Facebook, Mark Gaylor Photography. You'll also find me on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Alpha Creative Skills, or Mark Gaylor's Alpha Creative Skills. If you go head over to my website, you'll find all of my tutorials, presets, actions. They're all free.